He thought he was about to humiliate her, but had no idea. He had just handed her the stage that would end his reputation. The grand theater glowed. Under warm golden lights, rows of velvet seats filled with well-dressed guests murmuring with quiet anticipation. The air carried that familiar mix of perfume-polished wood and expectation, the kind that belonged only to places where talent was judged and egos were built or broken. At center stage, Victor Langford stood tall, adjusting his tailored navy suit. His voice smooth, confident, practiced. He was a name people recognized, a vocal coach whose opinions could make or end careers. And tonight he was in full control, or at least he believed. He was just a few feet behind the curtain. Emily Carter stood almost invisible, her simple gray cardigan blending into the background, her hands loosely clasped, as if she didn't belong in a room like this. Most people hadn't even noticed her when she walked in earlier. Some assumed she was part of the cleaning staff. Others didn't bother to look at all, and that was exactly how she had learned to survive, unnoticed, unchallenged, underestimated. Victor glanced back at her with a faint smirk, the kind that never quite reached his eyes. "You," he said casually, loud enough for a few nearby performers to hear. "Why don't you step in? We could use a little entertainment." A few soft chuckles followed, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. Emily didn't respond immediately, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable. The request wasn't an invitation, it was a setup. Everyone in that space understood it, even if no one said it out loud. One of the younger singers whispered to another, "This is going to be painful." Phones slowly appeared in hands, ready to capture the moment. Victor gestured toward the stage with exaggerated politeness. "Go ahead, don't be shy, show us what you've got." His tone carried just enough mockery to make the intention clear. This wasn't about music, it was about making an example out of someone who didn't belong. The spotlight flickered on, casting a bright circle at center stage, dust particles floating in the beam like tiny suspended stars. Emily stepped forward, her footsteps soft against the polished floor, each one echoing slightly in the sudden hush that followed. The crowd leaned in, some curious, some amused, some already bored, expecting exactly what Victor had promised, a spectacle of failure. She reached the microphone and paused just for a moment, long enough for the tension to stretch across the room like a thin wire ready to snap. Somewhere in the back, a quiet laugh slipped out. Then another. Victor folded his arms, satisfied, already turning slightly, as if the outcome had been decided before it even began. But then Emily lifted her chin, her fingers lightly brushing the microphone, and something in the air shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make a few people stop mid-breath. Her eyes remained calm, steady, grounded in a way that didn't match the role they had assigned her. And in that brief, fragile silence, just before the first note, the room didn't realize it yet, but everything was about to change. The first note did not explode, it did not command attention, it simply existed, soft, controlled, almost too gentle for a room that had been waiting to laugh. A few smirks lingered. Victor barely turned back, already convinced this would end exactly as he predicted, but then the note did something unexpected. It held steady longer than it should have, pure and unwavering, like a thread of glass stretched through the air. The faint laughter faded, not abruptly, but awkwardly, as if people were unsure whether to continue. Emily's eyes remained calm, her posture relaxed, not performing, not trying to impress, just present. Then the second note followed, deeper, warmer, carrying a resonance that settled into the chest of everyone listening. Conversations that had not fully stopped now dissolved completely. A man in the third row slowly lowered his phone, his expression shifting from amusement to confusion. Victor's brow tightened, just slightly, a reaction so small most would have missed it, but it was there, the first crack in certainty. Emily's voice began to unfold, not louder, but fuller, each tone layered with control that could not be faked. Years of discipline hidden beneath simplicity. The acoustics of the theater seemed to bend toward her, the sound traveling effortlessly to the farthest corner, without strain, without force. A woman near the aisle leaned forward, her lips parting, as if she had just recognized something familiar, something she could not yet name. The room was no longer waiting for her to fail, it was listening, and that difference changed everything. Victor straightened his arms, uncrossing, now his attention fully locked on the stage, his earlier confidence replaced with something quieter, something closer to calculation. Emily moved into the next phrase, her voice rising with precision, not rushed, not hesitant, each transition seamless, as though the melody had been waiting for her specifically. The air felt heavier, charged with attention that no one dared interrupt, even the staff near the doors had stopped moving. One of the Young singers who had whispered earlier now stood completely still, her eyes wide as realization began to form. This was not luck, this was not hidden potential suddenly revealed, this was mastery, the kind that does not appear overnight, the kind that is earned in silence, far from applause. Victor took a small step forward, almost unconsciously, his gaze narrowing as fragments of recognition flickered across his face. A memory, perhaps a sound he had heard before, but could not yet place. Emily reached the end of the phrase and allowed the final note to linger just long enough to leave the room. Suspended, no one clapped, no one spoke, because something in that moment felt unfinished, like the story had not yet revealed its truth. And as the silence deepened, stretching across every seat, every breath, every heartbeat, Victor Langford realized with growing unease that he was no longer in control of what was happening on his stage. The silence did not break it. Deepened, stretching across the theater like a held breath no one dared release. Emily did not rush to fill it. She stood still, her hand resting lightly against the microphone, as if she understood something the others did not. That control was not about volume, it was about timing. Victor felt it now, that subtle shift in power, the kind that could not be announced, only recognized too late. His jaw tightened as he stepped closer to the edge of the stage, trying to reclaim presence, but even his movement felt smaller than before. Emily's next note rose slowly, not sharp, not forced, but inevitable, like a tide that could not be stopped. It carried more than sound, it carried memory, something lived, something earned. A man in the front row leaned back, as if the note had physically reached him. A woman beside him pressed her fingers lightly against her lips, her eyes beginning to glisten without fully understanding why. And somewhere near the back, an older gentleman straightened abruptly, his expression changing from curiosity to disbelief, as if he had just heard a voice he thought the world had lost years ago. Victor's mind raced, now searching through fragments of past performances, recordings, competitions, voices he had studied and judged for decades. And there it was, not fully clear, but close enough to unsettle him. A familiarity hidden beneath simplicity, a signature that did not belong to a beginner. Emily transitioned into the next passage, her voice expanding effortlessly, filling the high ceiling, the balconies, the farthest corners. Without strain, the sound wrapped around the room, rich and controlled, each note placed with precision that only years of discipline could create. This was no accident, this was no hidden hobby, this was something far deeper, and the room knew it, even if they could not yet name it. Phones that had once been raised for mockery now hung forgotten at people's sides. No one wanted to interrupt what was unfolding. Even breathing felt too loud. Victor took another step forward, his confidence no longer present, replaced by a growing unease that tightened in his chest. He watched her closely, now not as a target, but as a question he could not answer. Emily closed her eyes briefly as she entered the most demanding part of the piece, a section designed to expose weakness, to push a performer beyond comfort. But her voice did not break, it did not strain, it soared, controlled, powerful, undeniable, the kind of sound that did not ask for attention, but commanded it without effort. A ripple moved through the audience, not noise, not applause, but recognition, the kind that travels silently from one person to another when something extraordinary is witnessed. At the same time, Victor's expression shifted again, this time more visibly, his brows pulling together, his lips parting slightly as realization began to take shape, incomplete but undeniable. He had heard this before, not here, not recently, but somewhere important, somewhere that mattered. And as Emily held the final rising note of the passage, letting it resonate through every inch of the theater, Victor Langford felt something he had not experienced in years: uncertainty, and the unsettling question forming quietly in his mind was not who is she, but how did I not know? The note did not fall, it transformed, stretching higher, then softening with a control so precise it felt intentional, down to the smallest breath. Emily did not move much, yet somehow she owned every inch of that stage, her presence no longer quiet, no longer invisible, but undeniable. Victor stood frozen, now his mind no longer searching, but racing, connecting fragments that refused to stay hidden. There had been a performance years ago, a voice that critics called once in a generation, a singer who vanished without explanation just as her name began to rise. And now, standing in front of him, wearing a simple cardigan and no recognition at all, was that same unmistakable control, that same emotional weight carried inside every note. The realization did not arrive all at once, it crept in quietly, piece by piece, making it impossible to deny. yet too shocking to accept immediately. A woman in the front row whispered something barely audible, and the man beside her nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the stage, as if afraid the moment would disappear if he looked away. Emily moved into the final sequence, her voice no longer building, but refining, each phrase sharper, clearer, more intimate. The power was no longer about volume. It was about precision, every note landing exactly where it needed to be, every pause stretching just long enough to make the next sound inevitable. The theater felt smaller now, as if the space itself had folded inward around her voice. The audience leaned forward, collectively drawn in not by spectacle, but by something deeper, something real. Victor felt it in his chest, that uncomfortable tightening that comes when certainty collapses, his earlier confidence now replaced with a quiet realization that this moment was no longer his to control. He had not created this, he had not orchestrated it, he had only revealed it, and that truth settled heavily in his expression. Emily opened her eyes slowly as she approached the final note, her gaze steady, not searching, not seeking approval, but grounded in something far stronger than validation. The room held its breath again, but this time not out of expectation of failure, but out of respect, unspoken but undeniable. The final note rose clear and resonant, filling the theater with a sound that felt both powerful and restrained, like a story being told without words. It lingered suspended in the air long after it should have ended. No one moved, no one interrupted, because they understood instinctively that this was not a moment to break. When the sound finally faded, it did not disappear. It settled, leaving behind a silence thicker than before, heavier, more meaningful. Victor lowered his arms slowly, his posture no longer commanding, no longer certain, his eyes fixed on Emily as the truth finally reached him, not as a suspicion, not as a possibility, but as something undeniable. She was never the wrong person for this stage. He had simply been the wrong person to recognize it. And somewhere in that silence, as the audience remained frozen between disbelief and awe, Victor Langford realized that the moment he had intended to control had already slipped beyond his reach, and there was nothing he could do to take it back. No one clapped, not because they were unimpressed, but because something about the moment demanded stillness, as if applause would be too small for what had just happened. The silence lingered, heavy and reverent, stretching across the theater like a quiet understanding shared by everyone at once. Emily lowered her hand from the microphone slowly, her expression unchanged, calm, grounded, untouched by the weight of what she had just done. She did not look around for approval. She did not acknowledge the crowd. She simply stepped back half a pace, as though the stage had only been borrowed for a moment. Victor remained where he stood, his mind no longer racing, but settling into a realization that felt far more uncomfortable than confusion. This was not an accident. This was not hidden potential discovered by chance. This was someone who had already reached the level he spent his career claiming to recognize, and yet he had failed to see it until it was undeniable. A murmur finally began to rise, not loud, not chaotic, but careful, as if people were choosing their words with caution, afraid to break the fragile significance of what they had witnessed. A woman near the front shook her head slowly, whispering to the person beside her, "That voice, I have heard that voice before." And the response came almost immediately, "I was thinking the same thing." Victor took a slow step forward, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the stage floor, but now every movement felt exposed, stripped of the authority he once carried. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came, because anything he might say would only confirm what the room already understood. Emily turned slightly, her gaze meeting his for the first time, not with defiance, not with pride, but with a quiet certainty that required no explanation. It was not a look meant to challenge him. It was a look that revealed something far more powerful, that she had never needed his approval in the first place. Somewhere in the audience, a single clap broke through, sharp, unexpected, then another followed, and then another, until the room filled with a rising wave of applause, not explosive, not chaotic, but steady, deliberate, the kind that builds not from excitement, but from recognition. People stood slowly, row by row, as if pulled upward by the same invisible thread, their eyes fixed on the woman they had almost dismissed minutes earlier. Victor felt it, then, not the applause, but what it represented, the complete shift of perception, the irreversible moment when judgment had turned into respect, and there was no way to reclaim the position he had once held in this space. Emily did not bow, she did not smile, she simply stepped away from the microphone, her movements as quiet as when she arrived, but now every step carried a weight that could not be ignored. As she turned toward the side of the stage, a man in the second row leaned forward, his voice low, but urgent enough to reach those around him. That is not just anyone, that is Emily Carter. Emily Carter. The name moved through the audience like a spark, catching quickly from one person to another. Expressions shifted again, this time not from doubt to awe, but from awe to realization, something deeper, something that made the moment feel even larger than before. And Victor Langford, standing under the same lights that once belonged to him, understood with absolute clarity that he had not just misjudged a performer, he had exposed himself as someone who could not recognize greatness until it stood directly in front of him. And even then, only when it was too late. The applause did not fade. Quickly it rolled through the theater like a wave that refused to break, each clap deliberate, each movement filled with a recognition that could not be undone. Emily paused near the edge of the stage, not turning back immediately, as if she understood that what had just happened was no longer about her performance, but about something far greater. The shift in how a room full of strangers now saw her. Victor stood motionless behind her, the sound surrounding him, yet somehow distant, like he was no longer part of it. His eyes followed her every step, searching for something to hold onto, some explanation that could restore the balance he once controlled, but there was none. A man in the front row rose to his feet fully now, his expression firm, his voice low, but steady enough to carry. She was the one 10 years ago, the Opera House in Chicago, the debut that sold out in hours. Heads turned, whispers sharpened, pieces began to connect faster. Now Emily Carter. The name moved with clarity through the crowd, no longer uncertain, no longer questioned, and with it came something heavier than admiration. It came with realization. How had she been standing unnoticed? How had no one, including him, recognized her sooner? Victor's chest tightened, not from pressure, but from understanding, the kind that arrives too late to change anything. He remembered the reviews, the recordings, the discussions among elite circles about a voice that had redefined expectations and then disappeared without warning. No scandal, no explanation, just gone. And now she had been standing a few feet away from him, treated as if she did not belong. The irony settled deep and unmoving. Emily finally turned slightly, her gaze moving across the audience, not seeking validation, but acknowledging presence. The applause softened, not because it weakened, but because it transformed into something quieter, something more respectful, a standing ovation that no longer needed noise to prove its meaning. She gave a small nod, not dramatic, not rehearsed, just enough to recognize the moment. Before continuing toward the side of the stage, Victor stepped forward, instinctively, as if to stop her, as if to say something that might repair what had already been exposed. But again the words did not come, because there was nothing he could offer that would not sound empty in comparison to what she had already shown. Emily passed him, without hesitation, her calm presence more powerful than any confrontation could have been. And in that brief moment, as they crossed paths, Victor felt it clearly, not humiliation, but something far more unsettling, the loss of authority that comes when truth replaces perception. The room watched in silence as she disappeared beyond the curtain. No dramatic exit, no final gesture, just a quiet departure that left behind a space filled with meaning. The applause slowly began to settle, but the energy remained suspended, lingering in every corner of the theater. People did not rush to speak. They did not immediately return to their conversations, because something about what they had witnessed demanded reflection. Victor remained under the lights, now alone in a place that no longer felt like his stage, his posture no longer commanding his presence, no longer unquestioned. And as he looked out at the audience that had just shifted before his eyes, he understood with a clarity that could not be ignored. Respect was never his to give, it was something he had failed to recognize. And in that failure, the entire room had seen exactly who he was. Backstage, the air felt different, quieter, heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed what had just happened. Emily moved through the narrow corridor, without urgency, her steps steady, her expression unchanged, while behind her whispers began to follow, not loud, not intrusive, but impossible to ignore. Staff members who had passed her earlier without a glance now turned their heads, watching her with a mixture of disbelief and quiet respect. One of the stage assistants paused mid-task, lowering a clipboard slowly. As recognition settled in her eyes, Emily Carter, she whispered under her breath, as if saying it too loudly might break the reality of it. Emily did not stop. She did not acknowledge the shift, because for her this was not a return to something lost. It was simply a moment that had always existed, waiting to be seen again. Further down the hallway, a door creaked open, and an older man stepped out, his posture straight, his expression serious yet softened by something deeper than surprise he had been in. The audience, he had heard every note, and now, standing only a few feet away from her, he did not need confirmation. He knew. "I thought you were gone," he said quietly, his voice carrying years of memory rather than accusation. Emily paused, just briefly, her hand resting against the cool metal of a nearby railing. She turned her head slightly enough to meet his gaze without fully facing him. "Gone is what people say when they stop looking," she replied, her voice calm, the same quiet strength that had filled the theater, now present in every word. The man studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod, understanding more than he could explain, before stepping aside, allowing her to pass. Without another word, further behind the curtain, Victor Langford finally moved his steps slower now, less certain, as he entered the backstage space that had always felt like his domain, but no longer did. He scanned the corridor until he saw her figure ahead, and for a moment, he hesitated, something unfamiliar holding him back, not fear, but the awareness that whatever he said next would define more than just this moment. "Emily," he called out the name, feeling heavier than he expected. She stopped, but did not turn immediately, giving the silent space to settle between them. Victor approached carefully, each step measured, his usual confidence replaced with something closer to humility, or perhaps the first attempt at it. "I did not know," he said, the words simple, but carrying the weight of everything that had unfolded. Emily turned, then fully facing him, her eyes steady, not harsh, not forgiving, just clear. "You were not supposed to," she answered, without hesitation. Victor's expression tightened, not in anger, but in recognition of the truth behind her words. He searched her face for something in opening a way to regain footing, but found none, because there was nothing to negotiate, nothing to correct. The moment had already passed. Beyond that, he let out a slow breath, lowering his gaze briefly before meeting hers again. "I misjudged you," he admitted, finally, the sentence hanging in the air, more for himself than for her. Emily held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a slight shake of her head, not dismissive, but final. "You did not misjudge me," she said quietly. "You revealed yourself." And in that instant, the hallway fell into a silence even deeper than the one on stage, because this time there was no audience, no applause, no distraction, only truth standing between them. And Victor Langford understood that some moments do not end when the curtain falls, they begin there. Victor did not respond immediately, because there was nothing left to defend. The words lingered between them, settling with a weight that could not be argued or softened. Emily held his gaze just long enough for the truth to fully land before turning away again, her attention no longer on him, but on the quiet hallway ahead, where the noise of the theater had faded into a distant echo. Behind them, a few crew members stood frozen, unsure whether to move or speak, as if they had just witnessed something that was not meant for them to interrupt. Victor remained still for a moment longer, his posture no longer rigid but uncertain, his shoulders slightly lowered as the authority he once carried seemed to dissolve, not taken from him, but exposed as something fragile, something dependent on perception rather than substance. He finally exhaled slowly, a breath that felt heavier than it should have, and stepped back, giving her the space he had unknowingly taken earlier. Emily continued walking, her pace unchanged, her steps soft against the floor, each one measured not in distance, but in certainty. She did not rush, she did not linger, she simply moved forward as someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The older man who had spoken to her earlier watched quietly from the side, his eyes following her with a calm understanding, as if he recognized that what had just unfolded was not a comeback, not a return, but a reminder of something that had never truly left. A young assistant standing near the wall hesitated before speaking, her voice careful, almost unsure. "Ms. Carter, I mean Emily." She paused, searching for the right words that would not sound intrusive or small compared to what had just happened. That was incredible. Emily stopped briefly, turning her head just enough to acknowledge her, the faintest hint of a smile, appearing not for recognition, but for kindness. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice soft yet grounded, before continuing down the corridor, leaving behind a silence that felt different from before, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but reflective. Victor watched her go, his eyes following until she disappeared around the corner, and for the first time in a long while he did not think about reputation or control or influence. He thought about something far less comfortable, the gap between what he believed he could judge and what he had failed to see. He glanced around the hallway, noticing the subtle shifts in how people now looked at him, not with open criticism, not with disrespect, but with awareness the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. The stage manager cleared his throat quietly, as if testing whether normal conversation could return, but even that small sound felt out of place. Victor straightened slightly, adjusting his jacket out of habit, but the gesture lacked its usual confidence. It felt more like a reflex than a statement. He took a step toward the exit of the backstage area, pausing briefly as he passed the microphone stand leaning against the wall, the same kind of microphone she had held moments ago. He looked at it for a second, longer than necessary, as if it now represented something different, something he could no longer control. Then he turned and walked away, his steps slower, quieter, blending into the background he once dominated. And as the hallway gradually returned to motion, conversations beginning again in hushed tones and footsteps resuming their rhythm, one thing remained clear to everyone who had been there: some performances end when the sound fades, but others begin the moment the truth is heard and cannot be ignored. Outside the theater, the night air felt cooler, quieter, untouched by the intensity that had just unfolded inside. Emily stepped through the side exit, the heavy door closing behind her with a soft echo that seemed to separate two different worlds, one filled with judgment and noise, the other with stillness and clarity. The city lights stretched across the street, reflecting gently off the pavement. Cars passed at a distance, their sound low and distant, as if the world itself had softened to match the moment. She paused near the edge of the sidewalk, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, taking in the silence around her, as if it were part of the performance that had not yet fully ended. Inside the theater, conversations had begun to rise again, but not in the same tone, not with the same certainty. People spoke more carefully now, their words shaped by what they had witnessed earlier that night. Names were repeated, questions were asked, connections were made, but none of it carried the same weight as the moment itself, because no explanation could replace what had been felt. Victor Langford stepped out moments later, the same door closing behind him, but the contrast between them was unmistakable. Where Emily stood grounded and composed, Victor paused, unsure of where to go next, his surroundings suddenly unfamiliar. Despite having spent years moving through places like this with confidence, he looked across the street, then back toward the theater, as if searching for something to anchor himself to, but there was nothing left inside that space that belonged to him in the way it once had. He noticed Emily standing just a few yards away, her presence calm, almost quiet against the backdrop of the city, and for a brief moment, he considered speaking again, saying something more, something different, but the thought passed quickly because he understood now that some moments do not offer a second chance for words that should have been said earlier. Emily did not turn, she did not acknowledge him, not out of dismissal, but because there was nothing left that needed to be addressed. The distance between them was no longer measured in steps, but in understanding. A car pulled up to the curb, its headlights cutting softly through the darkness, and Emily moved toward it with the same steady pace she had carried all night. The driver stepped out, opening the door with quiet respect. Recognizing her without the need for introduction, she paused for just a second before getting in, her eyes lifting briefly toward the theater, not with longing, not with regret, but with a quiet acknowledgement of what had been revealed. Then she stepped inside and the door closed gently, the car pulling away without urgency, disappearing into the flow of the city as naturally as it had arrived. Victor remained on the sidewalk, watching until the taillights faded into the distance, his reflection faintly visible in the glass of the theater door. Behind him, a man who had spent years defining talent, now standing in the aftermath of a moment he failed to recognize until it was undeniable. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible as the city continued around him, unchanged, indifferent to the shift that had just taken place. And in that quiet space between what was and what had been revealed, one truth settled with clarity: respect is not given by those who claim authority, it is revealed by those who never needed it in the first place. And that night the world did not just hear a voice, it remembered what dignity sounds like.